Welcome to Bible Workouts. I'm Jason Camacho. If you want to learn how to study the Bible in order to understand God's Word better, you're in the right place. These shorter tutorial videos are designed to be bite-sized Bible workouts that you can implement immediately into your own personal Bible study. In this video series, we're going to walk through the basics of biblical interpretation, and we're going to look at a general Bible study format that you can start using immediately. This is one of the video lessons from our free Bible study course. You can find the full course on our website titled Bible Study Foundations, which includes quizzes, homework, and helpful questions for self-reflection. I pray that course blesses you. Let's get into today's Bible workout. Welcome to session number 4. This is video number 1, where we're going to be going through the cultural context and making sense of how the cultural context can draw out some deeper truth in the scriptures. When we speak of the cultural context, this usually involves things like the customs, the practices, the values, and the worldview of the people of that time. You know, this can include things like marriage customs or family structures or religious practices and normal practices of that individual society and of that known, the world of that time. And so we want to be considering these things in order to understand the audience and the author, and to bridge the gap as much as we can between their culture and ours. So what I'm going to do is take you to John chapter 7, verse 2, and show you how this really actually works out. So in John chapter 7, verse 2, technically we'll back it up to verse 1 for context, right? After this, Jesus went about in Galilee, and he would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now, the feast of booths was at hand. Now, just reading that in passing, having no idea what that is, having no idea what would be involved in the Feast of Booths and how that would have been celebrated, you miss a lot when it comes to the context of what Jesus is about to do in John 7, when he says, "Come to me, all who are thirsty, I'll give you living water." Right? The backdrop of this is the Feast of Booths. That's part of the cultural context, is understanding what the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths here is. So just to give you a little bit of context, the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles is one of Israel's 3 great pilgrimage festivals in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, in Judea. And so this is the land of the last of Israel's 7 festivals in the calendar year, right? So their calendar year is coming to a close. It falls 4 days after the Day of Atonement. It's a 7-day festival celebrating God's present, past, and care and provision. God's present and past care and provision. It commemorates the wilderness wanderings, where the Israelites were living in, booths and wandering around as nomads, and so they commemorate those wanderings by reliving those moments symbolically throughout the Feast of Booths. The first day of the feast is a Sabbath day of rest involving a holy assembly, and throughout those 7 days, Israel is presenting food offerings to God each day. And on the 8th day, just like the first day, it's a Sabbath day of rest, no work, and just solemn assembly. And so this becomes all about gathering in the produce of the land that God has provided, remembering his faithfulness, that kind of thing. And what happens is during the 7-day period, the celebration in Israel, Jerusalem, every family constructs and decorates a temporary booth or dwelling place made of basic natural materials like palm branches, and then they would eat, sleep, and live there for 7 days to relive the wilderness wanderings. And so each and every day, except the 1st and 8th day, the Sabbath, they would wave their palm branches in every direction to signify the omnipresence of God, especially evident through the wilderness wanderings. And starting with the second temple, after it was rebuilt, a major part of the celebration was to draw water from the Siloam spring in Jerusalem, and then they would pour out that water on the altar as a prayer for rain and water in the coming year. Because by this time in Israel's calendar year, they had reached the dry season in that region, which would have really taken their toll on Israel and the people. They would have gone without rain for a while, which is why they would be desperately looking to God to bring the rainy season, give water, replenish us, refresh us, take away this dryness, bring life again. And it would mark a seasonal transition, right? So understanding that just about the Feast of Booths brings a lot of context to what Jesus is about to do when he goes down to Jerusalem and says, "Come to me and I'll give you living water," right? This is the context of John chapter 7. Another example would be John chapter 4. I just want to show you the importance of understanding the cultural context. For me, this is one of the more important contexts for me to get a hold of because it often gets so overlooked. In John chapter 4, we see the Samaritan woman. Jesus approaches this Samaritan woman from the town of Sychar, near the field that Joseph gave to his son. It's at Jacob's well. And so to understand what Jesus is really doing, we need to understand the cultural context of Samaria and Israel. Samaritans were considered to be half-breeds. They were half-Jews that were mixed and defiled by the surrounding pagan nations. So the Israelites, the full-blooded, pure-bred Israelites, would view the Samaritans as compromised, defiled, and not really pure, right? They're tainted. And so when Israel split into two kingdoms, it became known as Israel in the north and then Judah in the south, right? So Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom, while Jerusalem remained the capital of the southern kingdom. And if you read the scriptures, King Ahab's father built pagan high places of worship for false gods in Samaria. So Samaria quickly became known for pagan worship. And when God brought judgment on Israel and Samaria and sent most of the nation into exile, what happened was the king of Assyria brought citizens from all the pagan nations to fill those Israelite cities and communities within Samaria. So the Israelites that inhabited those cities eventually intermixed with the pagan peoples and produced unholy offspring that would be later known as the Samaritans, right? So the Samaritans, on the other hand, they believed they were the true descendants and keepers of the Torah. Their main religious site and place of worship was Mount Gerizim, which is the mountain that God used to declare the blessing upon Israel for obedience. And so the Samaritans believed that the Jerusalem temple and priesthood were not legitimate, when in fact Israel viewed Samaritans as the illegitimate. And so there's a lot of racial tension and hostility and frustration between Israel and the Samaritans. So that provides the backdrop and the context for Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman, right? We can even do this with John chapter 10, and I'll do it briefly just to give you a helpful example of why understanding cultural context is very, very useful and necessary at times to understand what's going on and how they would have understood that and why that specific detail. So in John 10:22, it says, "At that time the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem." So the feast of dedication is what many refer to as Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights. So the significance of Hanukkah is that the Israelites are celebrating Judas Maccabeus' victory in reclaiming the temple from the Seleucid Empire, right? The Seleucid Empire came in and desecrated the Jerusalem temple with their pagan ways. So Judas Maccabeus rises up with an army of rebels to reclaim what the pagans took from them. And so the significance of Hanukkah is they're celebrating spiritual reformation and freedom and the miracle of the oil that lasted for 8 days when it shouldn't have. They're celebrating the revolt against paganism and anti-Torahism and Torahism and victory in battle over God's enemies and gaining back the second temple and purifying it and cleansing it and building a new altar with sacrifices to God. And all of that is an 8-day celebration based on the oil that historically is said to have burned for 8 days in the temple menorah when it should not have. It should have run out. And so all of that becomes the backdrop for what Jesus is entering into in John 10, right? So all of these different examples are just supposed to get whet your appetite so that you're like, I want to know the cultural context even better. When you see events or different weird cultural practices or ways that things are said or done, it should make you go, okay, maybe the cultural context understood this differently than I do, and I should do my best to get into their shoes. So in the next video number 2, we're going to be looking at the authorial context. That is the author's context. And again, when you read the scriptures, just, anything that stands out to you that seems very foreign to you, isn't familiar, like it's probably a cultural context issue. So you should do some research. And you can do a very brief research and study on whatever it is that you're interested in regarding whatever passage you find yourself reading. So I will see you guys in the next video where we will talk about the authorial context.